Good morning again. If we can assemble ourselves and for the first panel, I'd like to welcome you back and let you know that unfortunately, as a result of illness, Bebin Keyanliolu of the Turkish Communication Research Association cannot be here, and her co-author Salvatore Schifo is in Italy. So that presentation, she cannot be here because of illness, which suddenly arrived yesterday. So it's the first two presentations on your program. Each set of presenters will speak for 20 minutes each. We'll take them one and then the next, and then we'll move to questions and discussion. So we begin with Pantelis Vatikiotis, a name I finally managed to actually say, and Zafer Yörük, New Media and Social Movements in Europe and the Middle East.
Thank you for coming. So let me draw for a while our project here, which is about the new media and social movements in Europe and the Middle East. A few words about the structure of our presentation. Firstly, we discuss a few things about social protest in both contexts, and we reflect comparatively in Europe and Middle East. Then we follow some theories of social movements, the two dominant paradigms, the old social movements and the new ones, which give us the way to move to the contemporary social movements and the debate on the role of media. And then we draw some of our conclusions. So we go through both of the case studies by having a look on the role of social media, a few things about the background of activism and mediated activism, some structural issues and dislocations related to both contexts, and then some outcomes in relation to the current situation and the future perspectives. So let me start with European protests, and then Zafer will go on with the Arab Spring. Yes, yes, I will. Okay, thanks. So, probably all of us are aware about these landmarks of the European summer that include Portugal, Spain, and Greece. And of course, in every single case, the role of social media was very significant in various occasions, in terms of the arrangement of demonstrations through the relevant calls they address, in terms of mobilizing supporters in the protest and then in the occupy of the squares, and then in terms of the coordination of the activities of people who were involved in this protest. But still, I would like to point out that we have some other exams where probably the role of social media was not so important. In the same context, we have some protests in Iceland and Ireland in 2008 and 2009 that actually ran in traditional forms of general strikes and trade union demonstrations. But even if we focus on this hot summer of 2011, we can see some cases like the riots in England in August, and even the protests in Italy and France, where it seems that the messages travel not very easily. So there is a discussion here about the role of social media, if it was so crucial. But even if we try to draw in terms of some longer lasting formations like the occupying squares, and by this we take into account the American Autumn and the Occupy movement in the United States, which of course was inspired by the Arab Spring and the European protest movements, then we can see that the role of social media was not the crucial one in the beginning. Only once the movement became visible in public space did it begin receiving attention on social media and in mainstream one, as Gerbaldo mentioned. One more thing that I think is interesting here is that most of the times we forget to refer to the role of the mass media. This is something that we'll try to do, especially in the case of Arab Spring. a few things about the background of activism. Of course, it's a huge, actually, area, so I would like to mention only some reference points, the recent ones. And of course, here we have two perspectives, the one which is the transnational one, and some mediated activist practices, including, of course, the anti-globalization movement, where diverse groups and organizations like leftist political groups, NGOs, anarchists, and more other were united. And, of course, the global justice movement. Significant is here the role of indie media as well as of the European and the world social forums in the coordination and in the organization of the movement. However, the war on terror that followed after 9/11 and the subsequent delegitimization and criminalization of the acts of dissent had its effect on the movement. So it seems that in this perspective we have a kind of moving from the transnational to the national and the local, as Professor Della Porta has mentioned. The question about the European movements, if we go the other way, if we are moving from the local and the national to the transnational. So here, I would like to mention that this new wave of protest that swept Europe, of course, has some continuities with the previous wave of protest, but I would like to mention also some differences related to the local, the national context. And here we come to the national perspective and the national political opportunities, or the lack of them, and the pre-existing repertoires of action and resistance. Just to draw on one case in terms of this kind of national peculiarities, and I would like to do it in terms of Greece. And taking into account previous repertoires of action and resistance, I would like to mention the riots of December 2008 that actually were triggered by the murder of a student by a policeman, followed by clashes with the police, marching, looting, and attacks to bank and police stations. And then this had, as a result, the occupation of buildings, as well as daily assemblies and organized actions. So we have something that took place before this kind of hot summer. Even if we focus in the case of the hot summer, I would like to mention that there are at least 6 general strikes that took place in 2011 in Greece, which means in the traditional form of protest. Reflecting now on the structural issues, what is specific about the European movements, that it's not the case for the Arab Spring, it seems that we have 2 dimensions, and this is the transnational and the national. The transnational one has to do with the global financial crisis, unemployment, inequality, and poverty. So the social demands here have an international character against the global capital, see here the IMF, as well as against the regional capitalism, see here the European Union. But also there is a national dimension that has to do with the political crisis, corruption, unequal distribution of power and resources. And here these kind of movements are against political corruption and the national elites. So coming to some preliminary outcomes about this European protest, I would like to mention that despite the limits of these collective actions, that of course had to do on the one hand with the exercise of police violence against them, as well as in terms of people exhaustion of being in the streets and occupying the squares. It seems that there are some aspects that are worthy to mention. And these have to do with the fact that a lot of disaffected individuals seized opportunities to organize collectively and protest on the streets, and they addressed by this way another repertoire of action. Moreover, the critique on the traditional political system and the failure to do politics was accompanied by the development of participatory and discursive practices in the very camps built in squares. So what about any transformative potential of this kind of movements. According to my perspective, it seems that it's more interesting to move beyond addressing this kind of transformative potential in terms of the prospect of another, let's say, spontaneous, in quotes or without, uprising. Just for the record, the last 2 weeks we had 2 more calls through Facebook against austerity measures in Portugal and Greece without actually any tangible effects. And I think it's more interesting to have a look in this kind of transformative potential in terms of what is happening in the local national context after this kind of protests and the occupations, and in terms of the empowerment of citizens and the development of antagonistic practices. Again, by drawing in the case of Greece, we have several self-organized projects that have been initiated the last 2 years, including non-monetary local exchange systems, direct producers-consumers networks, and self-organized by the workers' factories like the Βιομηχανική Μεταλλευτική in Thessaloniki. So these give us an idea about what is happening after these protests and how the people who were involved in them probably use their experience in terms of having some self-organized projects. Let's move now to the case of the Arab protests, and then we can come back to the discussion with the social movements.
Well, if I were not technologically disabled, I would do an animation here instead of this picture there. I would put the bad guys first, smiling, you know, who are down now. Most of them are gone now. And then the kid and the crowds would jump on gradually. I probably would start with the Ba'athist national anthem or something, and then come with the revolutionary songs. But as I said, I'm technologically disabled, so I guess this is such an animation there. Okay, so if we look at the background to the Arab Spring, we should start with the story of probably Ba'athism in the region, in the Middle East. You might say it is Nasrism, not Ba'athism, which began all this, but there are similarities, parallels, and similar aims. So I call all these Arab nationalists and Arab socialists, Arab bureaucratic regimes as Ba'athist. I tend to do that. Of course, Ba'ath is a specific party which do not represent all this. What we can say is they were the kind of typical early 20th century nation-state building projects projected into 1960s, late 1950s and 1960s, and survived throughout the Cold War period. So one of the things we should point out is that since the collapse of Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc especially, they have rather become anachronistic in the region. There has always been opposition to these regimes. The main opposition always being the opposition to the over-secularism of these regimes, and in the form of identity politics, led by Ikhwan throughout the region, or versions of Ikhwan, the Muslim Brethren, throughout the region. So we witnessed in throughout the existence of these regimes, we witnessed the gradual rise of political Islam in the Middle East. In 1989, when the protests in East Europe happened and the communisms of the time collapsed, in fact, there was a hope that these regimes would go in parallel to them, but in fact, it was happening. In 1991, the Front Islamic Salvation in Algeria won the elections, the first round, but the the president and the regime didn't allow the second round to go ahead and instead suppressed and illegalized the movement and suppressed the Islamist uprising, and this led to a very long civil war which caused like 200,000 lives up to now in Algeria, which is not very much talked about, unfortunately, around the world. And this war was waged by a government which was now supported by the West, by the United States and France especially, because they were not very comfortable about the prospect of having an Islamist government in Algeria, which would spread around which might spread around the Middle East. This way, apparently, another thing that we should talk about as the background or the kind of seeds of these Arab Spring protests is the usual, traditional, conventional, annual bread price protests, especially in North Africa. Every year, when the price of bread goes up a penny, everybody goes on the streets to riot. And they are big riots because these prices are controlled by the state, and everybody, it is like the carnival of the oppressed. Once a year, they are allowed to riot and do whatever they like. Of course, when I'm saying allowed, I'm not saying that the police allows them. Of course, there's police violence and everything on the street as well. So, but this is some kind of tradition of the Middle East. Each time the bread price goes up, everybody riots. That is another thing that we should mention. And since 1991, the first Gulf War operation, when Middle East became visible to the Western world, the women in Saudi Arabia started protesting openly, basically for the right to drive a car, and they still couldn't get that right, I think. That was another kind of origin of these movements we should talk about. Of course, we should also talk about the end of the mercantilist logic and the conventional form of nation states in the neoliberalization of the global economy. And finally, the bureaucratic authoritarian structures becoming history one after the other. Then, of course, the recent Iraq war is an important element in the before the beginning of the Arab Spring, and the Turkish transition here, which we have been living through, which is a transition from the logic of this mercantilist, Machiavellist, Kemalist structure to something different, based on some kind of neoliberalism, neoliberal economic structure. Okay, so the Turkish model has been talked about a lot during the Arab Spring. Coming to the role of social media, we always, the mass media in the Middle East has always been the vertical major ideological apparatus of the state, oppressive states. In 2009, these Twitter revolutions began, and they were taken up by Iran. In 2010, in Tunis, the Arab Spring began, as you know, with a similar incident which happened in Greece, quite similar. There we see we usually forget one element, which is the documents that were leaked by WikiLeaks about President Ben Ali and his wife, about their corruption at the time. So, in fact, I did call this the first WikiLeaks revolution, the Tunisian revolution at the time. Also, there were hackings by some international organizations of the internet system of the Tunisian state as well. In turn, of course, and then the Tahrir Square began in Egypt. In turn, both the Egyptian and the Tunisian regimes stopped the flow of information by closing down the internet and the GSM networks. Also, we should note that the Google somehow played an important role in the Tahrir thing, because the Google representative in Egypt was Egypt disappeared for a while, and then he emerged again on Tahrir Square, and that was a big deal. In fact, at the time, there were talks that he might become the next president, and so on. But of course, it didn't happen. So we see this deployment of interactive media and the new media and the parallel spread of protests around the Middle East. Now, yes, speak up. Okay. So probably we should not talk much about the structural issues and come to the outcomes. So as I said, it's spread around the Middle East, Yemen, Bahrain, and Jordan. And there is another format coming up with the Libyan style, which is the civil war style, which is the bloody and unfortunate style. And it was taken up by Syria, and the spring degenerated into somehow tribal civil war style. But what we see in general as the outcomes is a new Middle East is emerging with the adjustment to global neoliberalism, and from the kind of authoritarian Ba'athist structures to the beginning of some kind of democratic subjectivity in the region. And of course, some kind of technological parallels, if not determinism, with the development of new media and social media and communication technology, we see all these democratizations have some parallels with these developments. So, in conclusion, coming to the conclusions, if we talk about the phases of social movements, we usually talk about, we started talking about new social movements in the 70s, I think, with the kind of identity politics taking over the class-based politics which belong to the old social movements. But we can also periodize these differences according to the use of media. In the old social movement time, we see mostly the use of print media and the hegemony of print media and radio maybe in terms of media. In the time of new social movements, we see a new element becoming global around the world, which is the television. And probably the third phase, which we will see, is with the contemporary protests, we see the kind of networked new media connective kind of action.
Here we come to the contemporary protest, actually, where the focus is on the communication aspect, more or less, as the determining one of the organization and the mobilization of collective action. Professor Downing elaborated thoroughly into two of the approaches that you can see here in the slide, the one of Castells and his emphasis on the network, and the other one by Cerbaudo and the choreography of the assembly. Let me briefly introduce the third one about the connective action that is introduced by Bennett and Segerberg. And actually they make a kind of distinction between collective action and connective action, although both of them can be in play in an ecology of action. So collective action actually associated with high level of organizational sources and the formation of collective identities. So here, more or less, they summarize the two previous stages of the social movements, the old and the new ones. And connective action refers to contemporary social movements, which are based on personalized content sharing across the media networks. And Furthermore, they do another distinction within the field of connective action between organizationally enabled networks, referring here to some coalitions of NGOs, and to self-organizing networks, referring to Indignados, Arab Spring, and the Occupy movements. So I think that this approach as well shares the same problems with the previous ones that were mentioned before. No matter what is the focus of each approach, networking, the performance, or the interaction, when it comes to the evaluation of the protest, they do not take into account the societal problems, the antagonism in economic, political, and ideological structures of society. As such, we have to see media, both mass media and social media, as they are embedded into this antagonism of contemporary society, and actually they reflect them. So finally, some brief conclusions. When it comes to the question if we have a media, Twitter, Facebook revolution, and here we have some scholars who say yes, and some other who say no. It depends on their perspective. The first one actually celebrates the liberating potential of the new technologies. The second one having a critical approach in terms either of a kind of feel-good online activism that has zero political social impact, and this is the case of Dean and Morozov, or of a kind of activism not involving high risk and which is built around weak ties, as Gladwell says. Still, I think both approaches adopt an essentialist understanding of social media as registering somehow adequate or inadequate agents, conveyors of social change. What we need is to focus on the dialectic relationship between the agents and the structure, evaluating by this way the nexus of media, movements, and societies along the contradictions that influence the emergence and the prospects of such protests, amplifying or limiting their potential. And the last one, about the spectacle, if we have some time.
Yeah, do we have 2 minutes?
You've already had 27.
Okay. So we can leave it for your questions.
I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We move now to the second presentation by Ilke Şanlıer-Yüksel and Murat Yüksel from Deutsche University and Koç University, New Forms of Activism and Communication in Transnational Social Movements, Lessons from the Case of Istanbul.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's already afternoon. Today, we were going to talk here about our research on what's called as Istanbul, which is a transnational anti-capitalist protest action network started in 2009. Yes, are we ready? Yes. Toward noontime on September 26, 2009, a marching crowd carrying a big banner proclaiming we were all migrants stopped in front of a building with barred windows in the Kumkapı neighborhood of Istanbul. Euphemistically called the foreigners' guest house, the building is used by the Turkish state to detain the so-called illegal immigrants who were kept there until their deportation. And locked in that building and deprived of their basic human rights, these immigrants could be held in inhumane conditions indefinitely, waiting for their deportation from Turkey. And the chanting protesters demonstrating to confirm their solidarity with the immigrants who rose up against their conditions in the detention center to demand better treatment from the authorities were gathered by a call for action made through the website of Istanbul. Actually, that was how I and my colleague for the first time became aware of Istanbul. By that time, we were interested in immigrant social movements and their collective action. And Istanbul made that happen for us. Actually, throughout the discussion, we hope to respond at least some of the questions that were raised before us by Professor Downing and by previous presenters, especially about the question about the relationship among social movement users and social movements users of social media and other media format. And we would add to that their use of mass media as well. Istanbul, as I said, is a transnational anti-capitalist protest action network which was started by a coalition of activists in May 2009 to mobilize and coordinate wide-scale mass demonstrations against International Monetary Fund and World Bank meetings, which were scheduled to be held in Istanbul in October 2009. The name itself embodies both local and global dimensions of political activism through the use of a blended world created from resistance and Istanbul. And in Turkish, direniş and Istanbul, the Turkish version is Diren Istanbul. Organized basically through a website, Istanbul is basically an umbrella protest network, an inter-network hyper-organization of anti-globalization, if you will. Although initially started to facilitate the mobilization and organization of a transnational protest action against the IMF and the World Bank meetings, along the way, it also, and thanks to the internet, rapidly responded to a number of local and national issues and threats against humanity. From its founding in May 2009 until the main anti-IMF and anti-World Bank demonstrations, the activists of Istanbul organized about 20 public demonstrations, including the one that occurred in Kumkapı. And in our presentation today, we plan to do the following. First, we will explore the ways in which Istanbul communicated both among its active members and with the public it seeks to influence. For that purpose, we analyzed different means of communication Istanbul utilized by looking first at its use of the internet to mobilize people and organize protest actions, and second, at its attempts to attract mass media attention. And we argue that in order to achieve the passage from micro and what Professor Downing called as social movement media to mass media, Istanbul also organized various local protests and campaigns on issues which are not directly related to their main cause. In the language of social movement theory, they extend and expand their action repertoire in order to attract more media attention, which, as we will in a bit try to show, did not turn out to be a very successful strategy. In our analysis of the mass media coverage of Istanbul, it turned out that their protests on various sorts of issues, and even the ones that targeted their main adversaries, were rarely seen as newsworthy by the mainstream media. And we will end up with a final point which will make, with a final point saying that even though Istanbul did not prove itself to be a sustained and long-lasting movement, its real success lies somewhere else. Let me now turn to a brief description of some of the characteristics of the new transnational movements, which many social movement scholars have so far showed, and Professor Downing summarized that a little bit. And people have been trying to argue that transnational collective mobilization is one of the most dramatic changes we see in the world of contentious politics today. And this dramatic change asserts itself not only in the frequency of interactions across national borders, but also through frames of identification, adaptability to rapidly changing events, the complexity of protest campaigns, and the density and design of movements and networks. The fluidity of alliances that brings together a wide range of issues, actors, targets, and perspectives, new repertoires of action, and the boldness, assertiveness, and creativity of demands, claims, and more importantly, for our purposes, in the means of communication. And Istanbul, it seemed to us, reflects many of these characteristics. And we will now turn to a brief description of Istanbul as an example of a transnational social movement. Well, as part of this transnational social movement, which was started in Seattle in 1999, Istanbul also started to get ready for protest action as soon as it was announced in May 2009 that the next round of annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank meetings were scheduled to be held in Istanbul in October 2009. And various activist groups in Turkey, ranging from feminists, anarchists, and eco-pacifists to liberals and lesbians, bisexuals, and transsexuals, got together under the main theme of anti-globalization and global social justice. They formed this umbrella organization, or a network of networks, if you will, again, called Istanbul. And the main aim was to organize and coordinate wide-scale transnational protests against their main adversaries, which were IMF and World Bank in that case. And the organization labeled itself as Resistance Days Coordination Against the IMF and World Bank. And one of the important things about Istanbul was that they used the internet heavily in order to reach thousands of activists all around the world and mobilize them in such a short period of time and coordinate numerous mass demonstrations. For that aim, the first action that founders of Istanbul took was to launch this website in mid-July of 2009 with a call to raise an international voice against global capital. As framed by its own activists, the objective of the website and hence of Istanbul was to support anti-globalization and anti-capitalist activists, organizations, and individuals in and through the internet, and to contribute to the enhancement of global social justice through the creation of a social forum which would facilitate and coordinate direct political participation on issues like human rights, economic inequalities, environment, and other related problems caused by neoliberal capitalist globalization. In order to look at the role that internet played in Istanbul's activism, we employed a model which was developed by Donatella Della Porta and her colleagues in 2006, in which they suggest different categories of functions that the internet may play for a social movement. Although they list those functions as instrumental, symbolic, and cognitive, in our analysis we find that the most distinctive contribution of the internet to Istanbul is instrumental and cognitive rather than symbolic. And for the sake of our analysis, we also divide the instrumental function into two subcategories, logistical and organizational. By logistical function, we mean the internet's ability to produce effective and fast communication, thus easing the coordination of protest and keeping affiliated groups and individuals continuously linked and networked. Organizational function refers to the opportunities that the internet provides for individual members to participate in the decision-making process, and thus its potential to transform the organizational structure of the movement as a whole. Cognitive function, on the other hand, denotes the dissemination of information to members, the general public, and sometimes the media itself concerning the important issues that are either poorly covered or completely disregarded by the mainstream media. And with that, they were aiming to raise individual as well as public consciousness and awareness about the social problems at hand. More than anything else, Istanbul's use of the internet seems to have played a very crucial logistical function for coordinating the anti-IMF and anti-World Bank protests in Istanbul. Its website included a detailed map of Istanbul with meeting points, a calendar of activities planned for the days of the protests, press releases, pictures of the demonstration as they were instantly taking place, documents detailing the operation of the IMF and the World Bank, and an activist's cookbook, as they call it. The later document, the cookbook, provides information on the nuts and bolts of preparation for protest action, transportation routes, legal rights, and police station support in case of an arrest, even proper dressing for protest, and definitions of roles during the demonstrations. And the website operates in two languages, Turkish and English, but the most important documents such as the manifesto and invitation to the demonstration are available also in many other languages, including Hungarian, Hebrew, Kurdish, Bulgarian, Czech, Macedonian, Greek, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, Arabic, and Catalan. The multi-language character of the website is also consistent with the movement's transnational orientation. As for its organizational function, since the internet provides relatively cheap and rapid communication opportunities, the website operated as a networking arena for activists to interact with each other through forums and posts. Members of Istanbul use different computer-mediated communication channels and interactivity options, such as email exchange and posts on the website. Through their website, activists from all around the world were able to discuss and negotiate various organizational and tactical strategies. The resulting organizational structure of the demonstration that Istanbul initiated was the outcome of these interactions and negotiations among individuals, members, and the movement as a whole. In addition to facilitating logistical support for activists, then these features of the website provided important organizational functions at both internal and external levels. That is to say, the Istanbul's website turned out to be an organizational force that shaped and transformed both the relations among its members and the organizational structure of the movement itself. As for its cognitive function, the Istanbul website made wide use of opportunities presented by the internet to generate unmediated flows of information. The website became an alternative channel in providing information about operations of neoliberal transnational institutions and offering alternative solutions to the general public as well. Although very successful in utilizing the internet to disseminate information, as we will try to show in the next section, members of Istanbul still had to attract more media attention, more media coverage in order to maximize their outreach. And in order to achieve that, public awareness and increase their support, activists of Istanbul knew that they had to attract more media coverage. And for that purpose, they tried to integrate more colorful protests with novel activities into their action repertoire. For example, they organized a not money but food event against global capitalism and gentrification in the Tarlabaşı neighborhood in Istanbul, giving out food that was recycled from organic and local markets. Another interesting campaign that they organized was a party crashing event at the opening night of the 15th International Istanbul Biennial. In that protest, activists read a press release and played and sang songs afterwards. Their main message was to artists who were participating in the biennial, who they urged not to attend the biennial, which was sponsored by both Turkish and global capitalists. In addition, Istanbul also organized a protest around a human rights abuse case that was already receiving a little bit of media attention, with the hope of careful strategic manipulation of the media through spectacular activities. Hence, when the immigrants' protest that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation in the Kumkapı Detention Center hit the news headlines, Istanbul immediately organized a street demonstration to be held in September 26, 2009, to show their support for the immigrants who were held in the detention center. Activists of Istanbul also tried to link their detention center protests with their main networking purpose. They were not only trying to show their solidarity with the detained migrants, but also wanted to use this opportunity to attract more mass media attention, to repeat, which would turn their action into a cry for global justice. However, Istanbul's peaceful demonstrations in support of the immigrants in Kumkapı Detention Center failed to attract the mass media's attention at all. It was covered as news only in Bir Gün, a left-wing newspapers, and on Bianet.org, thanks to Nader and her team, an alternative news website. For the rest of the media, those protests against the guest houses turn out to be an issue that hardly makes the news. This brings us to the difficulty of carrying the message from micro to mass media. In fact, towards the later phases of the anti-IMF and World Bank protests, Istanbul also incorporated more aggressive tactics into their action repertoire. Many activists attempted to break through police barriers to physically shut down official meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. Furthermore, Black Bloc suddenly cutting into a Istanbul cortege started to throw stones to the windows of commercial banks and tossed Molotov cocktails at the police. Although Black Bloc was not a formal part of Istanbul, in subsequent mass media reports, its actions were attributed to all anti-IMF and World Bank protests. In order to understand the portrayal of the anti-globalization protests and the protesters in the mass media, we also collected news items from the period between October 6 and 8, 2009, from 8 mainstream Turkish newspapers. This produced a data set of 69 news stories. While only 5 of those stories employed a more balanced language, 64 of them portrayed protesters as violent actors and criminals. In the dominant media discourse, the protests were generally framed as a major law and order case and a threat to the nation's security. Our observations concur with some other researchers who pointed out that traditional mass media coverage of transnational activism tends to focus more on law and order problems than on substantive proposals of activists, and the passage from micro to macro media can be quite problematic. Okay. As for lessons that we can draw from the case of Istanbul, first of all, we would argue that the mere use of new communications media by Istanbul contributed a lot in terms of mobilization of activists, but it did not single-handedly change the character of the movement. The movement organizers adapted newly available media to the activities they were already pursuing. But yet that they did it so well, it offered a model for other organizations to emulate and adapt. The second lesson that we can draw from the case of Istanbul, we would argue, is the need for public attention through the use of mass media coverage may encourage activists to remain newsworthy by means of innovations that do not necessarily advance their main cause. That media commitment, however, may produce unintended consequences as well. In fact, despite all their intention, where Istanbul had little control over their portrayal in the mass media. Not only their participation in other protests was not covered by the mass media, their own protests, anti-globalization protests coverage became even more negative. The asymmetry between the movement activists and the mass media means that activists can rarely count on media coverage. And the mass media's time is not over yet. The final and the most important lesson that we would like to draw from the case of Istanbul is that, for various reasons, transnational mobilization and activism can be very difficult to sustain in individual countries. In our case, Istanbul, as a transnational social movement, faded out very quickly. Right after the IMF meetings were over, most of their activities stopped. The website still exists, but they don't do anything. They have a virtual existence, but in action, in practice, they no longer exist. Yet, we would like to end this presentation today with a final note that Istanbul should be considered as a success in a very particular regard. The kind of social ties and connections that it established throughout its campaigns, especially with the ones that include face-to-face interactions, and the new action repertoire that they transferred from transnational movements to national and local ones, it facilitated the formation of a much more unified, coherent and sustained social movement in Turkey today, namely the Migration Solidarity Network. If nothing else, just for that, we think that it's really worth the effort. Thank you.
Okay, we now have time for questions and discussion. How much time do we have? 15 minutes. So can we see the first question, comment, observation, please? Where's the... yes.
My question is to Murat and İlke. You said that this Istanbul was more instrumental, contingent, but not symbolic. I guess you didn't explain why you don't see them as symbolic. I mean, their practices.
They don't have much information in their website, and that did not come out in our interviews as well. So they did not see the internet serving a symbolic function for their movement.
It's kind of, something about their performances or street performances.
No. That's just based on our, empirical analysis of the
It's only,
website.
it was the reporter and her colleagues' analysis on the function of internet. It was the symbolicness of the internet that we couldn't find in our case.
Yeah, okay.
Not their general action repertoire at all. But when we look at the other actions, we can talk about their symbolic functions, obviously. Yeah.
I counted, the second question to Kanteri's answer, I counted the sentence on your PowerPoint presentation, but you couldn't find the chance to talk on that. It was saying that Baudrillard revisited,
Yes.
Arab Spring and European protest did not happen. Maybe you can, I
Thank
think
you.
that you couldn't finish the presentation too, so that this may give you a chance to say more on your data.
Okay, that was one of the major conclusions, but in order to make that argument, I should go back to Professor Dorman's article, which appeared yesterday, I think, in Radical, here, where he underlines that so much talk about new media, we forget about the function of the old media, that is the mass media as we know it. And in fact, also Professor Dorman mentioned in his presentation that the role of Al Jazeera for example, in the Arab Spring, especially the Tahrir Square circus, where every day, 24/7, the revolution was broadcast live from the square. So if we go back to this, okay, we emphasize the role of new media, but there is a certain role of mass media in these protests, and inquire into the nature of this function of mass media. I think we should look at Baudrillard's article about the Gulf War did not take place in 1991, where he talks about the CNN International's role in the, especially CNN International's role in the 1991 Gulf War. Was it 91? Yeah. And presents the whole thing as emphasizes the spectacular aspect of the whole affair. Of course, Edward Said, late Edward Said, replied to Baudrillard, saying that poor good old Baudrillard, we should send him to Baghdad with a bottle of Evian probably, or whatever he drinks, and with his toothbrush, and then see if it really happens or not. Anyways, but still, I think this point holds. And coming to the Arab Spring, I think the spectacular aspect, that the show, the performance, in addition to the connectivity, that performing a revolution for the canvas should not be ignored and overlooked in this case. And probably this spectacularity also leads to has something to do with the shortcomings and sometimes disappointing outcomes of these actions as well. That they were that they have more and more virtual dimension in their nature, and that in the expense of the real aspect or reality aspect. So in a sense, the revolutions are becoming cyber revolutions and virtual revolutions to a certain extent. Of course, I'm not saying the whole thing. That was the thing I was going to talk about in the conclusion. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Are there other questions or comments? Yes.
Hello. I've got one question to the Istanbul case. You said the activists cannot rely on mass media. That's exactly my experience. But what did Istanbul do about it? How did they draw attention of the public to their case? Did they have media of their own? Did they produce videos, articles, whatever, in order to get their intentions more public?
Now, other than the demonstrations and their activities, they do not have any means to extend their cause to the general public, other than trying to achieve more media coverage. To our knowledge,
for example, videos they produced not many, but 2 or 3 videos just to disseminate their aims, and they published or broadcasted their videos through internet. I mean, through their website and probably sharing websites, video sharing websites.
but the outreach is still very limited, doing that through the internet.
I mean, mass media is more limited, in my point of view, than the internet, because the internet is an international, global thing. Mass media, you're talking probably about national mass media. For my case, being from Germany, and a video published on the internet is more attractive than a good article in a Turkish newspaper, because I would never read the article in the Turkish newspaper. Because I just want to, I hope we have time to discuss mass media versus alternative media during this conference, because I think this is really important to be talking about.
Yeah, exactly. But for Istanbul, somehow attracting more media attention became much important.
Please. Please use the mic. Yeah.
I have a question on the same issue. I mean, is it possible that there was actually no communication channel between the activists and the mass media journalists? I mean, because in many cases, okay, journalists are people, exactly like activists are people.
Actually, we had one slide, you know, it was a press release, a lot of, you know, cameras were there, they recorded it, but, you know, they
No, I mean a direct channel. I mean, if you have a direct channel and say, I'm going to do this, I mean, you can create a news actually from on the table and saying, okay, tomorrow if I have the right contacts, tomorrow I will, I can be in any agency press or in any on any newspaper, just with a small notice, with a small news. Is it possible that maybe there was no access to this kind of channel?
They tried to use those channels, but they got filtered somehow through the process. They did not, you know, make the news.
Okay.
Yeah, they tried all possible ways to, you know, to achieve more media, mass media coverage, but it did not happen.
Yeah, there's some interesting cases. I mean, Al Jazeera in a number of countries in the Arab region found itself using a lot of citizen journalists because its own journalists were refused visas to enter those countries. And so there came to be a very effective use in a number of cases, I think, of citizen journalists in the region, precisely because Al Jazeera wanted to report but was unable to use its own professional staff to do so. So sometimes these, each situation, I think, varies. I mean, there's no kind of one law. There's a Canadian researcher, very able guy called Patrick McCurdy. Some of you may have come across his research. And he lived with the G8 protests in 2005, I think it was, in Scotland. I think I wrote the year right. But anyway, he sort of basically lived through the entire thing and sort of researched and sort of how people related to mainstream media. And there was a very strong contingent of people who said, you should not talk to any journalist. Because even if you talk to a nice journalist who's sympathetic and intelligent, her or his editor will probably not let them report the stuff anyway. So it becomes a diversion of time, a diversion of hope, and a diversion of energy. This is one view, right? Very strongly expressed by some activists, but not shared, of course, by a number of others. But in the intensity of at least that particular occasion, for some activists to be seen talking to the mainstream press in any way, shape, or form was almost seen as a betrayal. Now, I'm not saying that's universal. I'm just saying that emotions and attitudes to this question can become really quite intense in some situations. Does anybody else have experiences or thoughts to share, or questions to share on this question of mainstream and social movement media interactions or non-interactions? Anything that anybody would... Please, use the mic though.
Okay, so I have an experience. Actually, my question was exactly about my personal experience, which is about a movement of cyclists which started last year in 2012 in Italy, whose name is Salva I Ciclisti, so Save the Cyclists, actually directly translated. It was started by 38 bike bloggers who at the same time addressed all the main media with the same request. So please do something because people are dying on the street, and there was a manifesto. Actually, in less than 10 days, we reached the parliament in less than, well, actually, it was a big climax, and we reached to have a kind of representation in any newspaper. I mean, any newspaper in Italy was actually fighting to find some news about this new movement nobody knew anything about. And actually the core of the whole system was based on the fact that most of the time bloggers are also journalists. So bloggers have also a direct line, a direct connection to the editor of any newspaper. So if you go there as a blogger, as a journalist, you already know the people who you are talking about, or in many cases they are also the editor of any of journals. So that's the experience we had, and actually it was more simple to organize the demonstration, to organize kind of flash mobs and so on. I mean, I'm talking about flash mobs with 3 people, which were actually reported on any newspaper in Italy, which is something strange, because actually you need a lot of people to reach this aim. In Italy it was the opposite thing in this case.
I guess it's a bit, when we use the term, for instance, mainstream media, what do we mean is getting a bit more confusing, I guess, by the time. Because, for instance, do we mean the news broadcast of a national TV channel, or do we mean the web page where the video, a particular video of this news channel is published while the user comments are enabled, so people can comment on it? Because I remember once I was in a student meeting in Barcelona. This was before the Indignados. It was about the anti-Bologna process, which was against the privatization of education system. And they were really discussing about should we attack to the web pages of some news channels, mainstream news channels, but attacking not directly hacking, but actually filling it with comments to spread their cause. I don't know if they did it finally, but this was something it's a sabotage actually. So I see your point of refusing mainstream media totally, but I guess there might be more creative ways, not only to get more publicity via them, but to sabotage them and to spread your cause. I guess this might be another way of relating to mainstream media from the side of the social movements.
So far, what I've understood from these discussions is if you have like an organization and you want to portray your message, it's quite important that you first reach the masses before moving on to the mass media, so that your movement grows and then it becomes like so big that you cannot be ignored by the mass media. So maybe that's what perhaps Resist Istanbul should have done, or should still do later on. That they should use the network, like the internet and other social media channels, actively. And I think that's what these 2 gentlemen mentioned also. That's what I've understood. I don't know if I'm correct to interpret it in that way. That it's important, like, to filter through the masses, and the best way to do this is actually use the internet and use the internet social media first, so that your voice can be heard by the bosses of the media owners, and then they can portray you so that you can make it in the news, and then you can grow.
Do any of the panelists want to respond? I think this probably has to be the last question before lunch. Does any of the panelists want
quickly,
to? Yeah.
If I may. Yes, numbers are very important, but social and political change cannot simply be created by numbers. Of course, it's very important to mobilize as much people as you can, but it's also very important to get the public sympathy for your cause. If you can't achieve that, no matter how many numbers are going to join you, in the long run, the chances of your success is going to be very limited. That's why creating this public sympathy through mass media, I guess, for Resist Istanbul activists were very important. But of course, in terms of mobilization and everything, the use of media, they were quite successful.
One last question.
Is there any other? Okay, last one, yes.
I just want to make a contribution. I was working for a mainstream media during a protest during the IMF meeting in Istanbul a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. I made an interview with the members of the Istanbul. I mean, with the intention of just informing the public about their cause. But my intention was not putting the article or the interview on the Ekonomi pages, where the IMF meeting was taking the big share. My article was sent to the Ekonomi pages, and it went upside down, and the people, the activists, were presented as the naughty boys, were just accusing the IMF and the capital. So I was disappointed. I mean, no one asked me about whether I wanted to change the headline and the where or the description of the activists, which I did not do. So it went into print without my consent and without my information. However, that in order to get coverage from the mass media, or there's something ignorable, or should be in many cases, should be ignored by the activists or the social movements mostly. And we will have another session about the tekel resistance in Ankara, probably, which the main media ignore a lot of times, but a lot of the protests, but they were unable to ignore what happened. I just experienced that resistance or the movement, the Occupy movement in Ankara, again in the same mainstream media. It was totally ignored by the newspaper that I worked for. It took 78 days, and only one single article appeared on the newspaper which criticized the workers. That was all. This is mostly how the mainstream media looks at the social movements. Which newspaper are you talking about?
Sabah. Okay, well, to our panelists, I think our heartfelt thanks for very interesting and informative presentations, which will no doubt feed our discussions after lunch. But now I declare this session closed.